He wore the uniform with pride, did his time, followed the rules, and served his country without complaint. But years later, instead of being honored for his sacrifice, he got a letter from VA that would flip his entire world upside down. It accused him of lying. Fraud, they said, fabricating his disability. And just like that, decades of trust, service, and respect, gone with a single envelope. This isn't just one man's story. It's happening more often than you think. Veterans who thought their battle was over, now fighting a different kind of war, this time against the very system that promised to have their back. Some are blindsided by accusations. Others are dragged into messes caused by scammers or bad advice. But the result is always the same. The burden of proof falls on the vet. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on what really happens when the VA calls you a fraud. We'll show you 5 signs you may be walking straight into a debt trap without even knowing it, and how a single wrong move can cost you your reputation, your benefits, and even your peace of mind. Stay with us, because if you or someone you love has ever depended on VA support, this might be the most important thing you hear all year. It usually starts with something that feels harmless. Maybe you moved, started working part-time, or your medical condition improved slightly. You think the VA will adjust things if they need to, but months or even years later, you get a letter. And what it says, it's like a gut punch. You've been overpaid. We're reclaiming the funds. Sometimes it's a few $100s. Other times, it's tens of thousands. And the worst part? It's retroactive. Veterans often don't even realize they've been overpaid. The VA system is complex, and benefits are based on constantly shifting variables. Your income, marital status, disability rating, and other factors that change over time. But they rarely notify you in real time. So while you're doing your best to stay honest, the system quietly tallies up what it believes you owe. Take Tim, for example, a Gulf War vet with a 70% disability rating. He started driving for a delivery app to make ends meet. It wasn't a lot of money, but it triggered an income threshold he didn't know existed. A year later, the VA decided he was no longer eligible for a benefit he'd been receiving and demanded $11,000 back. No fraud, no bad intent, just a simple mistake, and now he was buried under debt he couldn't pay. The system doesn't always treat you like a human being. Once flagged, your case is sent to a debt management center. They'll send cold letters, threaten collections, and sometimes garnish your benefits. And even if you appeal, that money may be withheld while your case is under review. In their eyes, you're guilty until proven otherwise. This is how many honest veterans first get labeled as fraudulent. Not because they lied, but because they didn't know the rules had changed. Or worse, no one told them the rules in the first place. And what happens next? That's where the real damage begins. At first, you think it's just a paperwork issue. Maybe they need clarification, another signature, a medical update. But then the tone shifts. You get a call or maybe a letter that says your claim is under review for potential fraud. That's the moment everything changes. Your credibility is no longer assumed. Now, you're being treated like someone trying to game the system. For veterans, this isn't just frustrating, it's deeply personal. You serve your country. You put your life on the line. And now the very system that promised to support you is implying that you're lying. It's insulting, but it's more than that. It's dangerous. One common trigger? Inconsistencies between your medical records and your daily life. Let's say your claim says you can't stand for long periods due to chronic back pain, but someone saw a social media post where you were at your nephew's graduation, standing for a group photo. That one snapshot out of context can become evidence that you're exaggerating. The VA doesn't need a smoking gun. They just need doubt. And once doubt is introduced, everything you've said is up for scrutiny. Even your tone during compensation and pension, CNP, exams can be misinterpreted. If you downplay your pain, hoping to sound tough or not seem like you're complaining, they might take that as a sign you're fine. If you're too descriptive, they might call it rehearsed. There's no perfect way to answer, and every word can be twisted. This isn't paranoia. This is reality for many veterans. And once you're flagged, your file gets red stamped with suspicion. Benefits can be frozen. payments halted, and the burden shifts entirely onto you to prove you're not a liar, which is ironic, because for most veterans, honesty was never the issue. They just didn't know they had to defend their truth, like it was on trial. But that trial was only beginning. For James, it started with a knock, not a loud one, just enough to unsettle. A plain envelope. Return address, Department of Veterans Affairs. Inside was a notice. His benefits were being suspended pending investigation. No warning, no details. Just a line about possible inconsistencies in his disability claim. In that moment, years of service, sacrifice, and silent pain felt like they meant nothing. He called the number on the letter, hoping for answers. What he got instead was cold attachment. "We're reviewing your file," they said. "You'll be notified of any next steps." No one told him what evidence they had. No one explained what triggered the review. And no one asked how this would affect his family, because by then it already had. His monthly compensation was gone. The money he used to pay rent, cover medical bills, and keep food on the table frozen. And with it, so was his peace of mind. He'd spent years trying to rebuild after the military. Now, it felt like the rug had been yanked from under him by the very agency that promised to support him. What made it worse was the silence. Friends didn't understand. Even his wife looked at him differently, as if wondering whether he really had exaggerated. That kind of doubt cuts deeper than any injury, because when people question your truth, it starts to erode your own sense of reality. And then came the paperwork. Dozens of pages, statements, medical records, testimonies from people who had seen his struggles firsthand. He had to prove the very pain he had tried for years to hide. Because when the VA calls you a fraud, it's not just a fight for your benefits. It's a fight for your name, your dignity, and everything you've endured. But the worst part? James wasn't alone. Stories like his aren't rare. They're just rarely told. And what happened next would expose a much bigger problem buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and broken trust. What James didn't realize, at least not at first, was that the VA's investigation wasn't personal. It was procedural, a routine review triggered by an algorithm, a checkbox, or a missed signature buried in the system. But routine doesn't mean harmless. For veterans like James, it can mean devastation. The moment doubt enters your file, you're no longer a person with a history. You're a case number flagged for suspicion. This isn't just about one letter. Across the country, veterans report the same pattern. Sudden reviews, retroactive denials, benefits clawbacks, and assumptions of fraud without any real explanation. The system isn't designed to believe you. It's designed to question you first, validate you later, if at all. And that's what makes it so dangerous. For those who've never served, it's hard to grasp how dehumanizing this process can be. These aren't people looking for a handout. Most spent years pushing through chronic pain, mental health battles, and a maze of paperwork just to get what they were already owed. So when the VA turns around and labels them suspicious, it's not just financially crushing. It's deeply insulting. Some veterans lose their homes. Others spiral into depression. And many give up entirely, unable to face the burden of proving their suffering all over again. The system says, just appeal, as if that process doesn't take months or years. As if veterans have the emotional bandwidth to redigest trauma just to prove it happened. As if the default shouldn't be trust, but interrogation. And the cruel irony? The VA operates under the banner of support. But behind that promise are layers of red tape, outdated rules, and a culture that seems more focused on denying claims and honoring service. What happened to James was an accident. It was a predictable result of a system that's been allowed to question first and care later. But James wasn't ready to disappear. He knew what he had survived, and he wasn't about to let a broken process erase that. What he did next changed everything. And it wasn't just for himself. James could have stayed silent. A lot of veterans do. The humiliation, the paperwork, the hours on hold with a system that already made up its mind. It breaks people down. But James had spent too many years fighting to survive to back down now. So he started gathering everything. Every medical report, deployment record, therapy note, and combat log he had. If the VA wanted proof, he drowned them in it. He didn't just resubmit his claim. He wrote a timeline. He contacted old doctors. He found buddies from his unit who remembered what he went through, who could write letters backing up his injuries. He went to veteran support groups, and there he found something even more valuable than paperwork. He found stories just like his. Veterans who'd been cut off, denied, labeled as liars by the very system that promised to protect them. And that's when James realized this wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger. With the help of a veteran advocate, James filed a formal appeal. This time, he had representation. He also went public, sharing his story with local journalists who'd been investigating benefit denials. It wasn't easy. Reopening old wounds never is. But James wasn't interested in comfort. He wanted justice, not just for himself, but for every veteran who couldn't fight back, who didn't know how. And the impact? It was slow at first. Appeals take time. But word began to spread. Veterans who'd been afraid to speak up started reaching out. They wanted to know what he did, how he fought, who helped him. For the first time in months, James felt something powerful, momentum. Because here's the truth. When veterans fight back with facts, when they share their stories and force the system to see their humanity, change doesn't just feel possible. It starts to become real. James was no longer just a name on a flag file. He was a voice, a spark, and the system, whether it liked it or not, had to pay attention. But his battle wasn't over yet, and what happened after his appeal would leave even more people stunned. Months passed. Letters came. Then silence. James had almost memorized the tone of those cold, formal denials. Insufficient evidence, unable to verify, claim not supported. But this time, the envelope was heavier. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't even a delay. It was a full reversal. Approved. The same VA that had once labeled him as inconsistent, that had implied he was exaggerating or faking, now recognized his service-connected injuries, acknowledged his trauma, and reinstated his benefits. It felt surreal. But what stood out most wasn't the approval. It was the way they phrased it. No apology. No recognition of the stress, the sleepless nights, the emotional damage done. Just a quiet adjustment of status, as if the denial had never happened. James should have felt relief, and he did to some extent. But there was also something else. Anger. Because if he hadn't fought back, if he hadn't had support, if he hadn't refused to give up, none of this would have changed. The VA didn't admit they were wrong. They just moved the goalpost and hoped he wouldn't notice. And what about the veterans who never get this far? The ones who don't know how to navigate the appeal process, or who don't have the energy left to fight it. How many are out there misdiagnosed, dismissed, and quietly suffering while being labeled as frauds? James saw his win not as a victory, but as evidence of how broken the system truly is. And that realization hit harder than the denial ever did. He knew one thing for sure. His story wasn't unique, and that was the most disturbing part. Because the moment the VA reversed its decision, they didn't just give James the benefits. They handed him a platform, and he was ready to use it. What James went through wasn't just a personal ordeal. It was a warning, a reminder that even those who serve with honor can be left questioning their worth, not by their enemies, but by the very institutions meant to support them. He followed the rules. He wore the uniform. He put his life on the line. And yet, when he needed help the most, he was told he didn't qualify, that he didn't count, that somehow he was lying. For James, it wasn't just about getting a monthly check or access to health care. It was about dignity. It was about trust. And most of all, it was about not letting the system erase the reality of what he lived through. Because when someone spends years recovering from trauma, it doesn't just go away because paperwork says so. The truth is, stories like James's happen more often than people realize. Denials aren't rare, they're routine. Appeals take years. And too many veterans are left wondering whether the battles they fought overseas were somehow easier than the ones they face at home. That shouldn't be the case, not for James, not for any veteran. If there's anything to take from this story, it's this: don't be silent. If you're a veteran, don't let a denial define your truth. Speak up, get help, connect with others who walk the same road. And if you know a veteran, check in on them, ask questions, offer support. Because behind every denial letter, There's a person fighting to be seen. James didn't want to become a voice for others, but when the system pushed him to the edge, he decided to speak anyway, not just for himself, but for the ones who gave up, who were too exhausted to appeal, or who never even knew they had the right to fight back. Thanks for staying with us through this important story. If it moved you or made you think differently about what veterans go through, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. And if you found this video helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter, stories that often go unheard. We'll see you in the next one.